We'll see if I can make this happen. Okay, I think we might be recording.
It shows as recording on my end.
Okay, all right, Lyle, thanks for joining us. I'm just going to turn it over to you for a few minutes here, and then we'll see if there's some conversation maybe in a bit.
Sure, yeah, and I would welcome that. Thanks, Nathan, for reaching out to me. I was actually hoping that there was some sort of gathering like this happening. So no problem at all on it being fairly late. And as I told Nathan in the text response, I'd rather be with you folks than in the Zoom call that I was on at the time. So that speaks to you folks. But no, I can give a couple of updates on what I know about the CARES Act, while also recognizing that it was just approved a couple of days ago, and I think people are still sort of sorting their way through different things of what it means. But there's a couple of particular pieces I can talk a little bit about. One is what's referred to as the Paycheck Protection Program. And basically what it means is that small businesses and nonprofits, and I should always preface this with the reminder that I'm not a tax accountant or an attorney, and so I'm giving you my best shot at it. But small businesses and nonprofits are eligible to apply for what I would describe as a forgivable loan from the government. And essentially, you would be able to apply for up to 2.5 months of your staffing costs as a congregation or nonprofit. Plus, there's some additional things that you can apply for, like utilities costs and some other expenses. When I describe it as a forgivable loan, basically the way it works in a nutshell is if you compare what your employment level was from February 15th to June 30th of 2019 and compare that to that same time period from during 2020. And if your staffing level is at the same level in 2020 that it was in 2019, the entire amount of the loan will be forgiven. If you, to use the example of a business, if you had 10 employees last year and now you have 9 employees, 90% of the loan would be forgiven. So the idea behind that is to allow small businesses and nonprofits to not have to lay off staff as a result of this. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the gist of it. How does it work? My understanding is that you would apply for this loan through local banks, and local banks that are used to working with the Small Business Administration. The Small Business Administration basically is serving as the administrator, I guess, if you would think of it that way. And so banks would apply through their, nonprofits or businesses would apply through their bank, which then works with the Small Business Administration in doing this. It's still new enough. I was part of a webinar yesterday, and that and a couple of nonprofits had chimed in that they had reached out to their local bank, and their local bank was not familiar with it yet. So in that sense, recognize that it's new information for them as well. I read that the government was hoping to have the parameters for that to the banks by the end of this week. Obviously, there's a lot of information happening, and so so whether or not they'll be able to hit that or not, I don't know. But that's the in 250 words or less or whatever sort of summary of it. So what that means is that you can go ahead, and what I would encourage you to do is to go ahead and reach out to your bank to find out whether they work with those kinds of loans. And if so, who is the person that you will be working with? You might want to encourage your treasurer or whoever to start collecting the data of how much did we spend in staffing costs. Essentially, the way the amount of eligibility is determined is to look at your staffing costs during 2019 and total up what that is, divide it by 12 for your average monthly amount, and then take that times 2.5, and that's the amount that you would be able to apply for. And again, like I said, there are other aspects of it. Utilities are one that I know that comes to mind. And here there would be some clarifying things like, well, does that mean like because it also can include some things related to mortgage. So does that include the amount I'm paying, that we're paying on our copier lease, et cetera. And those are questions that I'm not sure if they have been, if that's been drilled down to that level to know that. But you could encourage your treasurer to start digging into that. There is a document that I will jot a note to myself that we have received. I forget, I think the source is actually the Small Business Administration or something similar to that I can forward to you. Who's the best person to forward something like that to, or either Amanda or Nathan or Susan? Are you collecting things that you're sending out?
Monica.
Monica.
And
Okay.
I can put it on the website too.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
send it to me.
Yeah, you can take a look at it and see if it's something that you want to put on the website. I mean, I think it's in broad enough exchange. I was talking with one nonprofit who said they were working with a colleague and they decided they were each going to share the information, and they ended up trading the same document that they had gotten. So I think it's pretty broadly out there.
So Lyle, can I jump in with a couple of questions that have come?
Sure.
So Joel was asking, do we need a 501c3 IRS letter to be able to access the CARES Act?
So my understanding on this particular piece is that it's for 501c3s, but in the case of like a congregation, I don't know, do you operate under the Central Plains 501c3? I know that happens in some conferences. If so, that you're still eligible for that. So I don't know if you're going to need a copy of the actual letter or not. My sense is not, because I mean, one way to think about it is this is also for small businesses. So if you don't qualify as a nonprofit, you probably still qualify as a small business, right? I mean, is sort of my understanding. That was the type of response in the one webinar that I listened to. Yeah.
So I'm just going on my own experience. I think some congregations might have their own 501c3s, but like I also know some congregations, like to get in on the Zoom licensing, they were using MCUSA's 501c3.
Yeah.
And so just to clarify also, this is something congregations can get in on. It's also something to share with the people in your congregation who run small businesses. Correct.
And exactly. So I think that's something for you to be aware of on both levels, and just recognize that provides I mean, that's also a pastoral care conversation that you can have with them, because my hunch is that a lot of the small business owners, in our congregations are feeling stressed because they're having to, they're wrestling with the, am I going to have to lay off people in my company, et cetera.
So can I just, that leads to a couple of the other questions that have come. One is, what should small businesses that have already had to do layoffs do about this? And the other part of that is, does this apply to farmers?
Yeah, on the first one, I'm not sure that I know well enough. I think I would encourage, in those cases, I would encourage probably talking with an accountant, with their accountant to dig more deeply into that, because I'm assuming that accountants are also going to be inundated with these kinds of questions as well. The impression that I was getting from the webinar that I was watching was to sort of say, do everything that you can to not do those layoffs, and in effect, the amount that you're going to get forgiven in this is depending on your staffing level. So in that sense, it benefits you to have your staffing level as close to where it was last year as possible. So in that sense, it would seem to suggest try and hire those back if you can do it. Now, I'm sure part of the response there is you're thinking, well, I'm putting faith in the government. There's going to be enough money there to do that, and I'm not sure how I would respond to that aspect of it. The question about would it apply to farmers too? I'm completely going out on my own here, but just to say that my understanding is that that they would be a small business, and would have less than 500 employees. One of the tricky parts there may be, whether the farmer, him or herself, is being paid as an employee, as opposed to a business owner. I don't know how those things fit together. But again, that's probably one that they should talk to their accountant on. I will say that also I'll include this as well in the information that I send to Monica. I'm aware of a Zoom call happening tomorrow with a person from the ECFA, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, I think is what it stands for. And then I encourage you to log on to, or to register for, or even share with your treasurers. When I registered earlier this morning, they said they've already reached their maximum of 5,000 attendees registrations, and so the first 5,000 who sign on tomorrow will be the ones who will get to participate. But by registering, you'll get the recording after the fact, and that's from a source that I would consider to be very, very, very good. So that could be something that I would encourage you to take part in, or to share with your treasurer to take part in. There. I'd also have a few other things that I can share or a little bit about, but are there more questions on that particular piece of it? But if there are, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I believe that very, very soon you'll be getting still another email from us with some of these things. And I think that the link to that webinar will actually be in that webinar, in that email that you're getting as well, and so forth. Another pretty key piece of it of the CARES Act, as I understand it, for individuals and families, is that each of us that have salaries under $75,000 as individuals, or $150,000 as a couple, married filing jointly, will be receiving a what was referred to, I guess, the last time around as stimulus checks, right? And so for many of the folks in our congregation, they will be receiving a check for either $1,200 or $2,400, or I think it's an additional $500 for each child that you have. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is, how do you have the conversations in your congregations about what that means? And, the email that I sent to our pastor was to say, what does it mean in our circumstances when I'm a salaried employee, not feeling the likelihood that my position is going to be eliminated? Bonnie's a school teacher, not likely to get laid off. And so we're going to receive a check for $2,400. And in reality, our expenses probably have declined. So what does that mean for me to receive that when there are people in our congregations and in our communities that are struggling? And so how do you have the conversations with people to maybe encourage them to say, would this be an appropriate time? Would it be more appropriate for you to share this in some way? And maybe think about at a congregational level, do you set up a separate COVID-19 fund? Because at this point, you really don't know what the mixture is going to be of people in your congregation that are going to need assistance, people in your community that are going to need assistance. Are there people in your congregation that are feeling like they're no longer going to be able to give to the congregation itself for its ministry? And so setting up sort of a COVID-19 fund might make sense, so that you could encourage people to give to that and make the decisions later on how that's going to be used, what mixture of those kinds of things. So that's something that I would encourage you to be proactive about, thinking about how you might want to talk about that in your congregation, as well as, frankly, being proactive about reaching out to people in your congregation who may be struggling. We all know that folks often have a hard time coming to the congregation and saying, I have a need. And so I think from a pastoral care standpoint, encouraging you to think about what makes sense in your context to reach out to people and encourage them to let you know when there are needs that they're having and so forth.
Lyle, one of the things I was just going to mention is last week on a conference ministers Zoom call, Franconia Conference itself was putting a benevolent fund together. And they had at first thought they would try to raise $50,000, and they doubled it to 100,000. I have no idea how easily they will raise that money, but I think there's anticipation of, big needs out there, and how can we all help meet those needs? So.
Yeah. And one of the reasons, I think I think it may be significant to start having those conversations sooner rather than later, particularly as it relates to these checks, for example, because I think human nature is that when the check shows up on my desk or when the check shows up in my account, it suddenly becomes mine in a way that we may think about it a little bit differently before it comes. And so if it shows up in my checking account, I may be more inclined to say, oh, cool, I just got another $2,400. Where can I invest that or whatever? And so having those conversations in advance can help us think about them more theologically, more in terms of a mutual aid component. Because, in one sense, you could say that the government here is actually trying to practice mutual aid. For a faith tradition for whom mutual aid was a significant part of our identity, and over the years, I think this is an opportunity for us to claim that identity and think appropriately and theologically about that.
So one other thing that Joel shared with me is yesterday he sat in on a webinar for nonprofits through a contact at Laurelville, and he said he'll email us the PDF and PowerPoints, et cetera, that he received. So Joel, do you want to say anything about that, or just leave it at that?
I'll just say, actually, it was the ECFA webinar. Kerry Miller sent me a link because of his connections to Laurelville. They were doing one, and it had great information. And I'm assuming they had a PDF and PowerPoints that detailed, and they give examples of a company or an organization, and so that you could actually plug in numbers and pretend to try to see what it is. And the thing that they stressed is that that basically any borrower, they're going to honor any borrower. Basically, the requirements are: did you exist before February 2020? Well, if you did, okay, well, you can borrow the money, and up to the amount that the employees that you have. And the one clarification, Lyle, my understanding was that they will forgive all the amount as long as it goes to qualified expenses like payroll, retirement. It can go to benefits, and then it can go to some things like utilities, and you mentioned mortgage and stuff. If you can use the money for anything, but you have to pay back then anything that doesn't qualify. So it acts as a loan, a low interest loan that you can defer and have up to 10 years at 4% interest. But if you use it for qualifying amount or qualifying expenses, then it's forgiven. So then it essentially acts like a grant. So it seemed like a really good opportunity.
Yeah, those are correct. And yeah, I would not be at all surprised if the webinar tomorrow is going to be very, very similar to what you saw yesterday, because the one that I watched, it was like they had, invited everybody to join back by Facebook Live the next day, and then they pretty much talked the same stuff. And one of the things too in there that one of the comments that you made me think of another comment that the webinar said, and that is because the bank is going to be receiving this money from the federal government, they're frankly not going to be in a position of worrying about whether you are credit worthy or so forth. So there's not a motivation for them to start. This is sort of crass in this regard, but there's not a motivation for them to deny anybody for these loans, right? So in that sense, they're going to be frankly wanting to, from the standpoint of maintaining a relationship with you, the bank is probably going to be wanting to help you in every way they can.
So I watched a video over the weekend that Michael Danner from MCUSA forwarded to conference ministers, and sorry, I can't remember the name of the organization, but one point they made in there, or 2 points. One is they said when you're figuring out your churches, if your church has to, for example, file for this, make sure that when they're talking about salaries, they include the value of your housing allowance. That was what they were recommending.
Yeah.
The other thing was that they were also suggesting that this is not a bottomless pool of money. So it's when it runs out, it runs out. You want to speak to any of thoughts about that, Lyle?
Yeah, was that was Vanderbolen? Was that the name of it? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that was the same. That's actually the same one that I watched as well. And yeah, I mean, and basically his approach was to say, include stuff as I mean, obviously you can't, within extremes, but housing costs. Our housing allowance, that's really just an accounting thing. It
Right.
is, it
It's an
is
expense.
salary for you, and it
Yeah.
is salary expense for the congregation. So do include that. And that's where the comments about, copier leases and stuff like that, his inclination was to include more rather than less, figuring that when your bank processes it, it's going to be much easier for them to say, no, this doesn't count, than to say, oh, you should have included this too, and have you go back and do that. The question about whether there is a bottomless pit, that webinar was the primary place where I've heard that piece of it talked about.
Mm.
Some of the other places have said things like, if the government realizes how quickly it gets used up and stuff like that, they're likely to allocate more money to it.
Mm.
Now, that's a balancing act. So for that reason, I would encourage you to move on it sooner rather than later, because there is no guarantee that there will be more. I mean, there's 349 billion allocated for this right now, but he went through sort of allocating, okay, there's X number of small businesses in the country, and there's X number of nonprofits. And so if everybody applied, there wouldn't be enough to go around. So that's sort of the balancing act, but there's really, one way to think about it is there's not really a motivation to wait. So you might as well go ahead and jump in sooner rather than later, in case that does come to fruition where there's not enough there. Yeah, and that was an excellent webinar for me. I learned an awful lot from watching that.
And we can either forward that to people or put it up on our website, although my guess is that's already from last Friday, so there's probably newer information out there.
Well, on their website, they actually, there was a webinar from Wednesday, and then there was a webinar from Friday after it was passed by the Senate. And then there was a version of it on Monday again, after the House had passed it, and with people asking questions. And largely, he was repeating the same stuff. And I don't think anything changed too much. So if you go to that website, save yourself, only watch one of them rather than 4 of them, because they're virtually all the same.
Okay.
I guess I'm a glutton for punishment, or I was a glutton for punishment yesterday.
Any other quick questions before we let Lyle go?
I would just add the question of back at the conversation about caring and sharing funds. You'll be able to watch it later, but right now Glenn Guyton is here at 11:30, started a live event from the MCUSA website, Facebook, talking about mutual aid with this CARES Act. So if you want more videos to look, because this will be live now but recorded for later, if you go to MCUSA's website later this afternoon, and you can get more information through Glenn on some of the ideas for mutual aid with this act.
That's
Yeah.
great to hear. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Question.
Couple of other pieces too, just to sort of, I mean, name on the Everence side of things, your advocates, and hopefully you would have already received word as well that that we've doubled the sharing fund pool. So whatever amount that your congregation thought it was eligible for in terms of the sharing fund it is now doubled. So make sure that you're aware of that. And also just a reminder of the excellent resources that are available from Lutheran Social Services with their call-in financial counseling. They do excellent work, and I'm sure that they are. I'm sure that their phones are ringing actively, but we're also told that we underutilize that resource as a whole. Everence churches do, so don't feel any qualms about encouraging that. And then another piece is, again, just sort of how you're communicating with congregations or with your members as far as giving. And, you know, if you're not already doing online giving, this may be a time to explore that. Encouraging people, you know, reminding as part of your online worship services that the ministries of the church do go on. And so, you know, be encouraging folks in that way as well. So I also would welcome hearing from you folks, you know, things that from your perspective would be helpful to have from me or Everence. At the same time, I also want to be careful with your total agenda, Susan, to not take the whole time.
Yeah. Okay, well, yeah, thanks, Lyle. And please, if you do have ideas things that you've been doing, let Lyle know about it. And I'm sure he's also available with other questions you may have as this goes on. And want to thank you again, Lyle, for joining us. It looks like Dave Husenfeld has a question.
Just a comment, Lyle. I don't know if this is very significant, but we normally have the offering in our worship service. And so we tried to figure out, well, what do we do? And we didn't have any offering prayer the first time. And then it was kind of awkward. How do you pray? So what we decided is that we're going to pray God blesses the offerings that came in through the week. So it's just, if that's helpful.
Yeah. Well,
Just an idea.
It's very appropriate. I think that's a very appropriate way to do it. I mean, you know, it's another one of the worship elements, right? That as you're thinking about doing online worship, you think about, you know, how do we do this differently? You know, how do we do our children's time differently? How do we do our work? How do we do our offering differently in an appropriate way? Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Lyle. I'm going to turn off the recording now.